My name is Keith Williams. I'm the founder and director of design at Keith Williams Architects in London. And it's my pleasure to speak to you as part of the Concrete Elegance talks. So tonight I'm adding to that, and I should be talking about my use of concrete, the way that it informs our buildings and our ideas and our kind of approach to materiality. I suppose that concrete's been used for more than 2,000 years. It really comes from the Roman period. And I thought before embarking on this talk, I at least ought to perhaps go back to a root definition. So the word concrete comes from Latin, according to Wikipedia, because where else would you go for your source? It comes from the Latin word concretus, meaning compact or condensed. It is the perfect passive participle of concrescere, from con together and crescere to grow. So that gives you perhaps a little bit of the root of the wording. That's the end of the lesson in grammar. But it's relevant in that the Romans, I think, were one of the first civilizations to actually embrace concrete. They didn't reinforce it, which limited their span capability, but they did produce extraordinary structures nevertheless. And this is the Pantheon in Rome. You're looking at the dome. Not a shot that's often published, actually. More often you see those shots. So it produces this extraordinary domed, scalloped, vaulted interior. And it is, I believe, still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, and that's been around for the best part of 2,000 years. I'll come to the Romans and a more up-to-date treatment of them, I guess, or an approach to them in our Novium project later in the talk. I've been thinking about concrete for many years through studies of Kahn and Corbusier and so on and so forth. But we first had the opportunity to experiment with its capability, and I'm going to talk initially about its sort of mass, its structure, its robustness, if you like, before I then talk a little bit about precision later in the piece. We were appointed to, several years ago now, to create a new house in St John's Wood. It became known as the Long House because it's long. And it occupies a kind of a zone in this sort of leafy, well-heeled, late Victorian suburb. The house looks like so, and I shan't talk in great detail about it. But to realise it, to create it, one day we arrived, having obviously got our planning permissions and so on, with a digger on site and started bashing things around, digging holes. And we created this sort of great subterranean undercroft in order to be able to insert the swimming pool, which is part of the kind of brief, which is actually what I'll mainly talk about. And what I enjoy here is this kind of temporary steel strutting, which forces the earth apart, ready to have this sort of concrete insert, if you like, going in to form the swimming pool. So big holes, as you can see, and then the swimming pool itself. And this is underground, and you can see that these great beams straddle the width, almost taking the place of those steel props that you saw earlier, sort of forcing the earth apart. And having forced the earth apart, we've managed to create the opportunity for daylight to come into the space and to play down across the beams, to play across the pool and produce this sort of extraordinary ladder-like, I guess, reflection. So it produces this very austere space. But I think what I found here was the kind of interest in the sort of beauty of the raw material, that often it's used and regarded as a sort of a cheap and nasty material, damp car parks full of stalactites. But actually, concrete, if used is right, it's actually very expensive to do, and it has a kind of material quality, I think, which sets it apart from many others. So one of our first forays into the mass use of concrete. We about the same time we're working on the Unicorn Theatre in Southwark, which looks like so, and what I wanted to try and achieve was a kind of was a series of sort of huge cantilevers over the foyer to dematerialize, I think, the corners of the building. So this is Arup's structural model, the grey being concrete and the blue and the red being pieces of steel clipped and bolted onto the concrete. But you can see there's this enormous cantilever, and the cantilever actually supports the main theatre, which is in the sky, 7 meters above the pavement. And then the cascade, as you can see, of the staircase, which is part of the procession from the street to the seat. So during construction, you can see this huge cantilever, again with trabeated beams manifesting itself. And then in the final building, where you see the beams exposed skeletal-like through the skin of the copper, which is the cladding material of the box. So the copper sort of rent apart to show the bones, if you like, of the concrete. And so further shots here showing the beams and the concrete and the copper that I've just touched on, and the staircase, which seems to sort of float in a gravity-defying sort of way. Concrete is incredibly heavy. It weighs about 2.4 tons per cubic metre, which is quite a lot. And so that staircase will weigh a number of tons. And I think what I enjoyed with this project in particular was the perversity of making something very heavy appear to be very light. And that concrete allows you to do that, allows you to play games with it. And also I talked a little while back of the sort of richness, the luxury of the concrete. And here I think it sitting alongside pre-patinated copper and black American walnut. You know, it sits very comfortably with these sort of slightly luxurious materials. In 2001, going back a while now, we won the competition to design the new Civic Centre in Athlon, which is in the middle of Ireland, on this former brownfield site with a church immediately opposite. So here the study model, the Civic Centre, which is debating chamber, the secretariat, and the library. We decided very early in the piece to make a largely concrete building for sustainability reasons and also for architectural reasons, which I'll come to. This diagram, I think, is important in particular on the left-hand side. You see the sense of brise soleil excluding the solar gain. That is the south-facing facade. In order to kind of prevent the building heating up in the first place, and using the great volumes of the entrance hall to exhaust warm air should it come to pass that the building begins to heat. So we did a lot of studies before we committed to concrete by using cardboard. And here we're modelling cardboard, ruining the front of Bureau Happold's offices for an afternoon in London with bits of cardboard where we're modelling the proportion and profile of what became the brise soleil on the building. Having studied that in many different options, we then created on site a prototype of the brise soleil created in this in concrete. It's actually, I suppose we call it cast stone because it's coloured, it's through coloured, it has a kind of a particular aggregate colour, has a particular series of fines, that's the granular material around the aggregate, and that's cast integrally with the structural beefy stuff that forms that actually does the work. And that can be in many, many different colours according to aggregate and fines. Here we've chosen something which is almost like crushed dolomite, which gives that sort of white, pale colour. And on the right, once the prototype was agreed and formed, the great precision that you see in those blades, those concretes, each one of which will weigh several hundred kilograms, which are bracketed off the glazing from the exterior. So here the detailed drawing, here the detailed shot showing how precisely the arises can be made. And I should say that these are all made in a factory, therefore there's a great deal of control over the moulds and over the fabrication and honing and polishing techniques. And then internally, that shot that you've just seen is the exterior of the space we're now looking at, which is the debating chamber, which again has this heavy in situ trabeated roof with the oculus, the round roof light above the debating chamber where the councillors sit. And then you can just see these tiny shafts of sunlight which seep between the brise soleil, which shows that actually it does its job. Above, the surfaces are clad in precast concrete on the roof terrace. So here we're looking at the exterior of the building, which is completely clad in the recast stone, which actually is sourced from works in Dublin, so 80 miles away or thereabouts. The importance of the architectural treatment of the surface materials is really that this is an important, fairly evidently important public building. All of the important public buildings in this and many other places, certainly in this town, are actually made of stone. Not white stone, not pale stone. They're a kind of almost like a mid to dark grey limestone. The bridge, the fort, the cathedral is actually a paler colour. But we wanted to have our building take its place in that sort of continuum of buildings where the public buildings are stone or similar, and the vernacular buildings are all sort of rough cast render with slate. So it says I'm an important public building, and that seemed to be right. And we wanted a total treatment, hence the blades, which could easily have been made out of metal, more easily be made out of metal, to be made out of concrete, so that you have this sense of the building being scribed and incised from the solid to create openings where required. Internally, the main atrium, which is actually 19 metres high, which does the job of venting the building. And here the views back from the library, where we have the trabeated roof once more, which is a kind of a motif, I suppose, that I've got to know and love. But it kind of reflects also the stripping that you have in the brise soleil on the exterior. So there is this kind of mimicry, if you like, and balance between exterior detailing an idea and interior detailing an idea. And here concrete, also used on the public benches. This is a bench which we created specifically for this project. And obviously seeing the building at night, and so on and so forth. So I suppose what this building taught me as distinct from the longhouse, and the longhouse was more about the muscularity of concrete, and here muscularity but also precision, which is an interesting kind of adjunct to the use of this very, very heavy material. As we were finishing Athlon, we won the competition a little further north in Ireland, still in Southern Ireland but quite close to the border. We're in Clonus, which is a town famous for, well, it's a very small town, so it's not famous for terribly much at all, apart from being the birthplace of Barry McGuigan, the famous boxer from the 70s and 80s, who was pretty celebrated for his pugilistic achievements. So in this sort of hill town, with its traditional winding street, main street, we created this library and county offices, created in similar panel system, the cast stone to Athlon that we've just been looking at. Here a smaller building, but and the masses are sort of grouped in a very sort of powerful way to express, I suppose, the use. The top part is the county offices for the library, and the bottom part is the library for the library. And I think one of the things we enjoyed, having learnt a lot about the precision of this material, which is precast, as I say, and comes in sort of 7 or 8 metre lengths, or less, but 7 or 8 metre lengths, so you can do a whole story or 2 double height space in one go, is that you can actually create very precise junctions. So if you look at the cantilever, it sits very directly upon the parapet of the panels below. So you get this there's no overlapping of form, which would be the more obvious and traditional way of detailing this. And also you can detail it so you have no apparent coping. There's no metal copings or flashings. It's all kind of dealt with integrally in material, which is allows you to produce these exceptionally sharp and clean clean lines. The Athlon bench creeps forward again into the second project. And here the dynamic of the new building as it protrudes from the kind of light industrial buildings that surround it. Internally, the 7-metre high space is capped with this trabeated roof here, which is punched through in enormous bays to bring light into the depth of the library. And again, as I've talked about concrete being a luxurious material, and again setting it off against the black walnut, that gives substance to that idea. And here, I think, again, precision, the things that one can achieve by precasting in an intelligent way, that the top cuboid, if you like, that projects out and appears to project out over the street, but doesn't, it sits at the back of the pavement. It actually kicks towards us slightly by about 150 millimetres, and it just introduces this sort of stripe line, this cut line, which separates the two forms and gives a kind of much greater sense of the dynamic in the composition than would have been the case had we gone all flush and smooth. And here you can see the building from the other perspective, sitting neatly in with the local vernacular. So now we go to the Marlowe Theatre. The headline of my talk tonight is the Novium in Chichester, which isn't this project, clearly, but it is part of what I've called, and other people have called, my Cathedral Cities phase, if you like. So I've been lucky enough to contribute to important buildings in two of Britain's most historic cities, namely Canterbury and Chichester. So here the Marlowe Theatre, which actually does have a lot of concrete in it, but I'm only going to talk briefly about the benching, which we've moved on from the original Athlon bench. It's a similar design, but here we've actually pigmented the concrete. So instead of it being grey, in contrast to the white buildings, here actually we've pigmented it with a kind of pale cream white, which reflects other aspects of this building design and gives, I think, a sort of rather sumptuous treatment to the public realm. So, to Chichester and the Novium, which is my last project, but not the last project that I will actually talk about, because I will end with the National Theatre. So Chichester is an extraordinary place. It has a very large number of Georgian buildings, some Victorian buildings, but it's all centred around the cathedral. And it has this wonderful city plan, which is kind of like, if you imagine drawing a city for a child, it would have a city wall, perhaps sort of roughly sort of circular here, a bit beaten about, but roughly circular, and it has a cross in the middle, a market cross, and it has a North Street, South Street, East Street, and West Street. So there's absolutely no excuse for getting lost here. The cathedral is just in the southwest quadrant near West Street, and we're just in the northwest quadrant on the site marked red. I should say that the listed buildings on this diagram are all marked in black. And you can see that the listed buildings start to run out in this quadrant because there was some substantial replanning during the 1960s and 70s which tore down all that, nasty Victorian stuff like a grammar school and a wool depot and all that, and replaced them with a car park. The one thing they did do, which was quite good, was put in this interesting circular library, which is quite a distinctive building in Chichester's sort of balance of buildings. So we won the RIBA competition to do two things, to build a new museum, but also to build a housing scheme and to try and complete an urban block which would occupy the whole of that car park site. And it's surrounded by, or at least has many adjacent, quite delicate tissue of Georgian buildings adjacent to it. These cottages are Georgian. But beneath the car park, at the end nearest to this viewpoint, in other words, in this bit of the car park where there aren't actually any cars, but where there are just markings, under there sits the extant remains of the Roman city's baths. And they date from the Flavian period, which is the 1st century AD, as I'm sure you all know. So what we're looking at here is the hypercaust, and this is about 1.5 meters below the present day pavement at street level. and we're looking at what is certainly an apse, could have been actually a dome. There appears to be insufficient evidence to determine that. But I understand also that there are elements of Roman concrete in amongst the masonry. So maybe we've come from Roman Rome to Roman Britain, and they brought some of their concrete with them. To give you an idea of dimension, that semicircle is about 8 or 9 meters in diameter, so it's quite a substantial thing. Our task, and as will be evident, I suppose, from looking at the slides, that our task was to rediscover that archaeology, and it had been surveyed in the 1970s, covered over by backfill and car parking material, and kept encased until a future opportunity for redevelopment came along, and the city were determined that this was such a valuable asset that this should be part of the museum, and that tended to therefore suggest that the museum would go over it. We spent a long time thinking about what kind of material this museum should be. As I say, the museum is part of the site and housing would occupy the rest. And our early studies suggested brick because there's a lot of brick in Chichester, and many of the background buildings are brick. But we thought long and hard about this, and actually, even the library, the circular 1960s library, has a different materiality. It has a kind of a whiteness, a paleness to it. The cathedral, which is made in Caen stone, has a sort of yellowy whiteness to it when it's cleaned. And so we began to think that whilst the cathedral is the biggest gig in town and will remain so, that the material we chose at least ought to have a coloration closer to that than perhaps the brick surrounding buildings, which are fine as though some of them are primarily background buildings. So we decided to say, hey, we are a public building, and that gave us the opportunity to colour the building and choose a material which is a cast stone again, which had something to do with that idea. So then we began to develop the form of the building in relation to the housing. We began to explore the sections, and here you can see the section through the Roman remains being some metre or metre and a half below street level, with the Roman entrance gallery and 2 further galleries above. So here the cutaway drawing, and early images showing the view from the street through a shop window, a vitrine, if you like, which would reveal the remains to the passing public. As it turned out, when the exhibitions were developed, there was a particular requirement to introduce projection, which meant we had to reduce the level of daylight in the public hall. So actually, in the end, part of that became screened by a film artwork. In other words, an applied film artwork. Nevertheless, the idea still works because you can still see into it. Here in this early study, there's a lot of concrete, as you can see in the grey, but intriguingly, that right-hand wall, as we look at the screen, was done. We were proposing brickwork at that time. And it was only later that I decided that we should have a total approach to concrete, so as to make a distinction between Roman archaeology, which is primarily masonry, and our new 21st century stuff. So here the cutaway of the various galleries with their wooden floors, and the archaeology all linked together by this staircase in the exploded drawing, which takes you wandering up through the building of this long processional stair to the cathedral window at the top, of which more later. So conceptual sketches which show the massing, or the developing massing of the form, and how that would integrate and handle the junctions between these quite small-scale buildings, the Georgian ones immediately to the south, and this much larger building with its big bits, and how we could make sense of that architecturally, and how we could allow them to be comfortable bedfellows, if you like, while still allowing each to breathe in its own way. We came under, I can't tell you how difficult it can be to build contemporary buildings in historic cities, there is this key date, which some say is 1820 and some say is 1830, which is the end of the Georgian period. And if you propose buildings that look like they were designed after one of those two dates, then at least a section of the community will look at you with a deep suspicion, as though you're foisting some, you're committing some appalling kind of sin by introducing contemporary thinking and contemporary design into a historic city. But I think our clients here at Chichester and also in Canterbury for the Marlowe Theatre recognised very clearly that whilst these cities have an incredibly important past, fantastic historic buildings which are their main draw, they must have a future. And I think it's about our buildings in both cases try to celebrate and embrace that idea of a continuum and introducing important new buildings into the historic cityscape. So this drawing was really produced, I think, in answer to criticism during the planning process from those who perhaps weren't seeing the importance of what we were trying to do, and saying, oh well, you know, there's no proportion, there's no idea, there's no control, there's no aesthetic in the facades. So I just began to overlay proportional systems, the golden sections, squares and circles and so on, over our building. And in order to actually get that to work, all I had to do was to tweak the height of the turret by about 100 millimetres down, and everything else just dropped into place, which sort of told me really that when something, after you've been doing this a few years, when something looks about right, it probably is about right, and this is a way of kind of testing it, which seemed to work quite neatly and quite nicely, which then produced the final elevations, the final form. So we began to build. We began to build the ordinary aspects of the project, the retaining walls and the lift shafts and so on and so forth, and the piling. We did a lot of work on the coloration of the concrete and its finish, which I'll come to. And we also did a lot of work with the engineers, not only on that, but also on the piling. The engineers with Techniker and Matthew Wells and his team helped us find a way of sitting the building very lightly on its site. We needed to be very careful about the archaeology, and we needed to find ways in which we would impact the least. So the piling system that eventually came through actually only sits on 6% of the footprint of the site. So it has a very light touch and it leaves the archaeology intact. So our building kind of bridges over the archaeology, over the Roman baths in that sense. And so the piling is limited primarily, although not exclusively, to the edges of the site. But it does always dance around the archaeology itself. So in goes the piling, the secant walls and so on and so forth. My end vision, if you like, was to create a sort of lustrous concrete of an even higher order than the in situ that we've tried to, we've worked with previously. And we had many samples created, and what you see here is our sample in the office, which was put together in a laboratory by a concrete supplier, and actually the finished thing. And I'm going to share with you the warts and all process to get from something that's knocked up in a lab by scientists in white coats to the kind of the reality of a building site. There are few seamless routes between one and the other. So the first part was really about the performance specification, and again Techniker and Matthew Wells' team helped us draw up the specification. I wanted to go from I wanted to move from the standard grey concrete, cast concrete, into something which had a surface texture, one, and two, had a sort of luster, had some sparkly bits in it, because I think I wanted to see if we could make a kind of lustrous concrete that added a subtle sheen and dimension to this, to me, wonderful material. And this is not easy. We're dealing with very heavy materials that get put together on site in often pretty awful conditions. You know, somehow always seems to be they're pouring concrete in January and it rains and it's awful and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult. We introduced a series of silver granite aggregate elements and fines into the concrete, and then surface brushed it to achieve the finish where on the right hand side where the finger is pointing. Not my finger, I should say, my product architect. So there was some concern about how we might actually achieve this finish on site, this brushed finish, and the concrete firm's rep said, well, I used a toothbrush. So we did think actually having a magic sparkle machine, i.e. issuing toothbrushes to our contractors, was probably not going to go down well. So we decided to sort of wing that and work it out when we got on site. There's a great difficulty in a small building in preserving batches of concrete because you can't pour it all at once. You can set aside sort of aggregates and fines, but you can't 100% guarantee that what's going to come back to you on site. You know, one pour might happen in October, another one might not happen until mid-November, and so the opportunity for variance is quite significant. So, you know, that was a great concern, so quality control at the batching plants. And two, I think the early samples that came through were completely unpromising and nowhere near what we actually had in mind. As you can see from the samples, the small one, mid-top, was actually what we wanted. And these various samples that are coming through have very little relationship with that, obviously. But again, you know, Duffy, who were the concrete subcontractors of Vinci, who were the main contractor, worked with us and Techniker to try and get there. And various panels began to appear. We critiqued them. We talked about arises and jointing and how the spacer bar holds, which are a necessary part of formation of these concrete panels, would be treated, how we would deal with surfaces and so on and so forth, and light fittings, all of which had to be cast into the flank walls. We drew it endlessly. Each one of these panels is 2.4 by 1.2. It's a piece of plywood. And I think, and it's 250 mil thick, so I think that weighs about 2/3 of a ton, each one of those panels, which is a huge lateral force pushing out on the formwork. Hence, it has to be bolted through to stop it bursting. And you know, a great deal of effort put into the quality of the shuttering ply, the slip membrane to ensure that the concrete and the form debond comfortably, and so on and so forth. And you know, as the walls are beginning to go up, the first concrete pour, we're getting discoloration and patchiness and streaking and honeycombing and all the things that you actually don't want. And so, you know, various techniques were applied. No toothbrushes, but bag washing, blasting, light sanding and sealing. And in truth, I don't actually know what they did on each panel, but it was a combination of one or more of those techniques was introduced to produce the final treatment. So once we got those what we did was to establish from our sample panels and the first pour the sort of quality control benchmarks, and then referenced everything back to that as the project progressed. So, but again, you're getting formwork issues, you're getting, you know, patching and, you know, bursting where surfaces haven't been cast in properly, or they burst through when the formwork struck, and you get streaking and finishes. And my project architect put this down as sort of finishing fear, as lots of anxiety through this whole process. Because I've said to the client, when they said, we don't really want concrete, won't it be a bit like a car park? I said, don't worry, I'm going to do a special finish. It'll be fine. What sort of special finish will you have? They cry, and I say, well, I'm not sure yet, but it will be special, don't worry. And when I relay this to the office, they all put their head in their hands and say, how are we supposed to do this? You know, and I said, well, I don't know, but I think, you know, I haven't decided what we should have, but I think a sparkle, and you'll find a way of sorting it out. So anyway, they did. It wasn't easy, I have to say. But you get the effects of moisture drying out, because obviously there's a huge amount of water goes into a concrete pour, so that has to find its way out somewhere. A lot of it gets absorbed in the hydration process of the concrete forming, but not all of it. But in the end, we do actually create a lustrous material. It does sparkle, and it has produced an extraordinary kind of effect. the process wound on, the formwork continued, and the building, its in situ components, begin to take shape. The archaeologists are working on the dig because we had to leave the archaeology all covered up whilst the main construction was going on, so there's no damage done. And then the archaeologists are working away, labelling and carefully excavating with brush, with toothbrush, I guess not with toothbrush, to expose the remains. Meantime, we're working away on the exterior, the cast stone, again with Techniker, the manufacturers, who did Athlon and who did Clonus Library with us. And we're looking at many, many different finishes, and we could have had pinks, browns and greens, but actually we didn't think that had much to do with Chichester. And so we went for a sort of slightly honey-coloured, honed finish, which has a sort of a colour affinity to the cathedral stone. It's not exactly the same. It's actually slightly creamier in reality than it appears on these photographs. But it has a sort of granular quality which gives it the sense of being stone, although one is working with much larger panels, so it's clearly not ashlar or conventional stone in the sense that one would know. So it's a flatbed process, and here we can see some of our panels popped from their moulds, turned over and polished and honed, ready for final, or as part of the final finishing process. So in the factory, you have a great degree of control, you have a great degree of authority, if you like, technical authority over the final finish. And then the magical thing is that one day all the stuff turns up on a flat loader and gets craned into position, and it all seems to go up in an afternoon. And then I think we're cutting now to the building as it's being finished. So you're beginning to see the concrete emerging and being viewed over the remains. And I think the very clear distinction is evident between the 21st century concrete and the concrete and masonry of the Roman artifact. Here you're getting the hint of the staircase that is indicating to you as a visitor that if you think about these things, that's possibly the route up from the street through to the galleries. That there are events along the way, such as the, at least architectural events, places to sit, which is incredibly important in a museum, but again, I think done, I hope, with great elegance in terms of the material quality, where we have this black American walnut floating bench set against the concrete and the Portland stone flooring. And then the route up the stairs begins to emerge, and you then arrive at the introductory gallery, with roof light, top light brought into the space, the library and archive, and then the routing up to the main stair, which takes you up right to the top of the building, the highest public point, and the Cathedral Window, which is a little edicule, if you like, on the side of the building. From where the views back down, the staircase remind you where you've been, and obviously then the top light, which is also part of the ventilation system of the whole building. It's a kind of flue which draws heat out through the roof, comes into play. And then, of course, the spectacular vantage point over the cathedral and the rooftops gives a kind of wholly new aspect of the city, and a reconnection with the city from whence you came in order to go to this building. In order to make sure that we got that window in the right place, during the design phase, we actually hired a cherry picker with a camera and popped it into various positions to determine where we should place finally this window, feature window, so that people get that view. And here the gallery, which is 6 meters high to the underside of the beams, as a host space, ready to receive the fit-out, which was done by exhibition designers. We inputted into it, but didn't lay the whole thing out. But they have sort of followed the language of material, if you like, of walnut and glazing and so on in deploying their artifacts. And as you go deeper into the plan, there's an education room, which also gives the kids views out over meeting room and exhibition room, gives kids and others views out over the cathedral from a different perspective. And the terracing here, if you like, the roof lights and terracing, the roof lights sit in this sort of concrete terracing. You're looking at the parapet of the building here, which is integral with the wall finishes of the cast concrete, the cast stone, which forms the elevation. And the paving itself is also concrete, and recognising the importance of this roof as an elevation, actually, that we've treated this as a consistent coloured surface to produce this sort of foreground, if you like, to the cathedral, important foreground. And then the building, of course, in context, so we see it from close by the cathedral at the end of the street, where the turret, the large form in which the education room is a sort of signifier of this important building at what appears to be the end of the street. And as we close in, we see the building coming through in its form. You can see the large panels, the precision of the arrises, and the inscribing, the cutting away, as I established in my early sketches of the massing and the form and so on and so forth. The vitrine, the undercut for the entrance, the juxtaposition of the historic buildings in brick and the pale cast stone in the new building. I think this shot shows a seagull at the top, so the seagulls are quite keen on it and gives them a marvellous new vantage point over the city. And just to remind ourselves, I think that we are in the cathedral city, so I think that the way the material works makes the building stand out, yet it fits in formal terms very comfortably into the, not to everyone's taste, but certainly to many people's taste, fits very comfortably into the city. And I think the design in architectural and massing terms developed very positively, because the creation of the turret and the bringing of the mass towards the camera as we look at this view, it happens to be northward, but towards the camera, allows the cathedral to aspire to sort of breathe and dominate that vista and acts as a terminus point. So that's very important. So we have, I think, contributed a small, modest, but actually powerful and appropriate building built in concrete in a brick Georgian city, a medieval city. So I'm going to end with Sir Dennis Lasden's National Theatre, which is a kind of a total essay in concrete, and here shown from the apex of the 45-degree angle, which organises the plan and the entire building. Incredibly powerful, dramatic shot. Several years ago, I was doing architectural tours around there as part of open house. I did a number, and typically we would get 20 to 30 people to take round and explain what Lasden was trying to do. This kind of extraordinary use of strata that gives a horizontality to the composition, which is then pinned through by the lift towers, stair towers, and the fly towers of the theatre. And I suppose the composition of the audience profile was probably 2/3 architects, architectural students, the odd structural engineer, and the rest were, the public, civilians, if you like, i.e. not part of the building industry. And so I spent ages and ages and ages sort of explaining how the building was made, how the formwork was used, the immense care that was given to each piece of formwork with its offset timber planking to produce this particular effect that Lasden had in mind, sometimes horizontal, sometimes vertical. And inside, in particular, a sumptuous treatment of surface. And for the benefit of the public, I suppose, and I wasn't trying to be patronising, I was just trying to explain how concrete works, and it's kind of like, one could see it a bit like jelly. You can it'll take the mould of whatever shape you care to construct. So anyway, here a jelly of Buckingham Palace, not mine, but it illustrates the point, I think. So you can sort of squirt it into wherever you wish to squirt it in order to make whatever shape you wish, in principle, rather like jelly. So we did our tour, and I took everybody round, and we arrived at the end point, and accompanying me with great attention was was this lady of, I suppose she was in her mid-60s, very intelligent, posh lady, went to the theatre very frequently, so knew the building very well, went to see shows, drama, productions, etc. And she said, I wanted to come on this tour because I wanted to know more about the building that I go to so much. And I've always loved the plays here, or mostly, and I've quite liked the experience of being here, but I've never really understood the building, and I never really understood why it's concrete. And I reinforced the idea that it was a total composition, that the walls, the ceilings, the structure, the floors, everything was all made from concrete, and that was the total vision, and it couldn't possibly be anything else. She said, no, I understand exactly what you're saying, I understand precisely what you're saying, and you've almost won me over. I think this building is really wonderful. I just have one question to put to you at the end. I said, yes, what would that be? And she said, why did it have to be made in concrete? Could it not have been made of something else? So at that point I began to think I probably failed in my mission, but there we are. I think the National Theatre remains one of the most important, if not the most important, post-war concrete building in this capital, perhaps in the country. It's an extraordinary work, and the level of craft and the use of in situ concrete there is quite extraordinary. So I think on that note I will end, and just to thank you for listening and thank you for coming along tonight. Thank you.